not to get too Duke Ellington on you, but I don't get around much anymore. And so I think maybe I should introduce myself. As I look around, I see some wonderful, familiar faces, old friends, newer friends, and people I hope will become friends, but who I haven't met. And I don't, because of conditions that are largely beyond my control, I don't get to Sangha much anymore. So, I'm Dave Haskin, and like my dear friend Don, I've been around the Dharma block a few times, including being a part of SnowFlower since the early 90s. And I'm just delighted to be here. This really, as Don and I were talking before during the sharing period, about how this really feels like home. That it is just so delightful to be here with friends on the path. So, the way things have been happening lately, I'm so aware of gifts, and aware in a way that maybe I wasn't before, and this is such a gift to be able to be here all together, to share the practice, to share how we practice. And that's a little bit of what I'd like to talk about this afternoon. Now, our practice is so often described and taught as a linear process. Do this and that will happen. Breathe in awareness and mindfulness, and awareness and joy will arise. And this sense of linearity is sometimes true in our practice, but I think we all know that as often as not, when we breathe in awareness, it takes about 1/8 of a second for monkey mind to come back. And that's how it is. So I think a more satisfying way of thinking of our practice, our life practice, as well as what we do when we're actually meditating, is that it's like breathing. When we sit, of course, we breathe in, we breathe out. We learn to be aware of our in-breath, to feel our in-breath, and to be aware of and feel our out-breath. And that's a pretty linear practice right there. Breathe in, breathe out. The breath is usually, unless we're feeling obstinate and stubborn and we hold our breath for a while, the in-breath is about the same length of time as the out-breath. But that's not actually what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is we could look at breathing in and breathing out is a way of describing a bigger aspect, a bigger picture of our practice. And this is the in-breath then, in this context, is what Don was talking about this morning. The seeking refuge, the coming home. We come home to our true selves, as Thai calls it, to our bodies in the present moment. We come home to our Sangha and our friends on the path, and we refresh and we renew and deepen our practice with our spiritual friends. And that leads to the out-breath. And the out-breath in this context is how we engage ourselves in the world. And one of the truly wonderful and amazing things about how Thai teaches this practice in the Dharma to us is that, logically enough, as with our actual breath, you can't have one without the other. There are some schools of practice that emphasize one or the other, that emphasize sitting, the in-breath. Thai emphasizes sitting, of course, and Sangha, which is in-breath. But of course, what he does so amazingly and uniquely is talk about the out-breath. But again, there can't be one without the other. And the reason I find this satisfying to think of our overall practice as being analogous to breathing is that they're both part of the same ongoing process, as opposed to do this and that will happen. So thinking that there's an in-breath and an out-breath kind of puts it in that realm of this is how we practice, as opposed to this is what we'll get if we practice. So as Thai teaches us, then there's a time to come home and there's a time to leave home. There's a time to rejuvenate, to refresh, and there's a time to go out and bring the characteristics of that homecoming, of that refuge, out to the world. Now, this in and out breath that I'm talking about here isn't as linear or as clean or neat as our actual breath. And it can vary in terms of time and duration. So, every morning Mary and I sit, and that's our morning daily in-breath. And then we have what we call our sit and sip. Well, actually, our sip and sit, because it's preceded by coffee. And then we sit, and then we go about our days. So we breathe in, and then we take our out breath and go about what we're going to do in the day. And sometimes either the in-breath or the out-breath will be the dominant way we live. Projects, events, whatever life unfolds for us might mean that we're out in the world more, or conversely, maybe there's not much going on, or we feel a need to draw in, so there might be a week or 2 or 3, some period of time, where we breathe in, where we refresh, where we rejuvenate. It's mostly the out-breath I'd like to talk about today, but the wonderful thing about looking at it this way is that you can't separate the two, in-breath or out-breath. So I'm going to start by talking about what we can cultivate in the in-breath that helps us be so much more present on the out-breath. But I begin by saying this out-breath, I want to be real clear, can manifest in many ways. We talk in this tradition about engaged practice. But there's no right or wrong way or arena in which to engage. Engaged practice might be that we engage those nearest to us, our family, our friends, our partners, our partner, our colleagues at work, or it can mean devoting ourselves to social justice and everything in between. The idea is that we're present, fully present to it. However we engage, though, it begins with an aspiration, I think, or at the foundation of this. See, I said begin, and it's just that natural tendency, isn't it, to be linear. But an important part of the foundation of the out-breath that we cultivate in the in-breath is sometimes called bodhicitta. A good translation for that is the mind of awakening. Bodhi is awakening, same root as Buddha. Citta is a mind, simplistically, the mind. Bodhicitta is an intention or a motivation grounded deeply in our practice. It isn't a goal, it's an intention. And there's a fundamental difference between goals and intentions. Goals are something that we wish to attain, usually, but not always, that could be quantified over a certain period of time. And goals are good, but intentions are what I'm talking about here. An intention is an inner commitment to exploring how we want to live. In other words, a goal is the destination. The intention is the path to the destination. In our world, we tend to measure the effectiveness of an action by its outcome. But the Dalai Lama reminds us that the true value of an outcome is not, of an action isn't the outcome, whether it's successful or unsuccessful, but the motivation behind it. So bodhicitta is the desire, the motivation for liberation and to alleviate suffering. And as we practice, we can start with that as kind of an intellectual practice, an intellectual kind of statement. And as we practice, it seeps into our bones. And that's what happens during the in-breath of our practice. Thai describes bodhicitta this way. He calls bodhicitta the mind of love. And he says, the mind of love is the deep wish to cultivate understanding in ourselves in order to bring happiness to many beings. It is the motivating force for the practice of mindful living. That's a pretty big statement. It's the motivating force for the practice of mindful living. With bodhicitta at the foundation of our thinking, everything we do or say will help others be liberated. This obviously is a big thing. It's not, I'm going to try and do better about cleaning up the dinner dishes. This is really a big and important thing. So I'd like to kind of do a brief dissection of our practice and how our sitting practice, our in-breath practice, which comprises of the in-breath and the out-breath, helps us cultivate this bodhicitta. When we practice, first we ground ourselves in our body. This is you may have heard the phrase or the word shamatha. We get concentrated. We become fully present in our body. The mind stills. And when the mind speeds up again, we come back to the body and the breath, and the mind stills. And as we become more concentrated in this way, we can start observing what all comes up in these little noodles of ours. And what comes up could be kindness or wholesomeness. A lot of what comes up, not so much, right? It's just yak, 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 yak. And, but whatever arises, what we're training ourselves to do is turn toward and greet whatever we encounter, whatever comes up, without, like as if that was Velcro and we were Velcro, without attaching to it. One analogy I use sometimes is, it's like standing by the side of a busy road, and all these cars going back and forth are all the thoughts that we get when we meditate. Do we really, these cars are going by at 50 or 60 miles an hour, do we really want to get in one of those cars, let alone all of them? But that seems to be what we do when we meditate, isn't it? Or it can be what we do, or when we're not meditating. So we practice stepping back a little bit, observing, and ultimately as we watch this and kind of detach from entangling with a lot of these thoughts, we can accept them. It's like, oh my God, did I just think that? Oh, what a bad part. No. And we can just say, okay, this is what has arisen. And we realize that all the stories that arise in our mind, the futuring and the pasting, the shaming and the blaming, the rehearsing and the rehashing, we see that they're nothing more than stories that arise because of the causes and conditions in our life. So we can observe them with kindness and patience, because you know what? Those causes and conditions aren't our fault. I'll give you an example. People who were abused as children will, in the absence of mindfulness, tend, or who have any issues as children, but just as an example, who were abused as children, tend to act out of that place of abuse until mindfulness can arise. So they might be angry and aggressive. They might be withdrawn and victimy. They might seek to excel. They might, seeking to excel isn't a bad thing, but it's still reactive to the causes and conditions in this person's life. So we can just observe it and become curious about it and say, oh, of course I am as I am. Of course I've just had this violent thought, or I feel like a victim. Of course it's that way. How could it, given the causes and conditions in my life, be otherwise? And when we start realizing that, we can, as Ty teaches us, hold that part of ourselves like a baby and comfort it even when it cries. And when we observe these things in this way, they start, at least in that one moment of mindfulness, to lose their power to compel us to act in a certain reactive way. But most important when it comes to bodhicitta is that when we observe and are with ourselves in this kindly way, compassion arises. Compassion is often called a quivering of the heart in the face of suffering. And to me, what that means is that we no longer are afraid to turn toward suffering, but rather turn toward suffering first in ourselves with the wholesome desire to alleviate suffering, to understand, to accept, and to alleviate suffering. And this, when we practice this on ourselves, which happens over time. It's not a matter, I want to be real clear about this. This isn't a matter of I'm sitting down to meditate, I'm now going to examine all my difficult states of mind and cradle them, and then when I stand up in 20 minutes, everything will be cool. That's not how it works. This happens over time, but we understand the old mindfulness expression, it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. We are as we are through causes and conditions that aren't our fault. Just as a wave arises when causes and conditions are correct. Temperature, wind, currents, whatever causes waves to arise in the middle of the ocean. When those things happen, the wave arises, it's there, and it falls away. So we see that we're a product of causes and conditions, and then we can start to see with compassion that the person who caused us to suffer, or who we think caused us to suffer, also acted as they act out of causes and conditions. Now, there's nothing about this that gives them a bye. Oh, I was abused by my father growing up. Oh, well, so that's not what we're talking about. But we're talking about increasing awareness as well as acting appropriately and having boundaries. So we start to understand that in the example I was using, the parent who abused the child very likely abused him or herself. Because in many, if not most cases, that's how abuse gets handed down from generation to generation. And there were unknowable causes and conditions, societal, family history, religious, cultural, ethnic, whatever conditions. So that person is not at fault. It's not their fault, but it is their responsibility. It's a message that resonates pretty heavily when we go into prison. So this is how compassion arises, when we understand the bigger picture of suffering. Joseph Goldstein puts it this way. He said that turning toward our own suffering with understanding and without reactivity is the doorway to compassion. And compassion is one of the two foundations of bodhicitta that I'd like to talk about. The other is interbeing. And I've already talked about that. We realize that even though we've been hurt, even though we may have strong feelings and perhaps even understandable and justifiable feelings about those who may have hurt us, that we all suffer. And again, there's nothing about this to give somebody a bye who causes suffering. That's not where this goes. In fact, it goes to wise action and good boundaries. But it also leads to a bigger picture. So we can look at suffering, starting with our own. And the place to look at suffering, the time we most often look at suffering, that's kind of tailor-made to look at suffering, is when we sit with our in-breath and an out-breath. So we practice shamatha, and shamatha, another way of saying shamatha is concentration, and concentration leads to insight. And through this insight, we start to understand, and from this understanding, compassion grows, and a real embodied sense of interbeing. Oh my God, I'm suffering. Everybody here suffers. Anybody here not suffer in some way? Someday somebody's going to raise their hand. Then I'll be flummoxed. I won't know what to say. Lou Richmond is a Zen teacher, and he became, a number of years ago, he became horribly ill. It took years and years and years for him to recover. And it wasn't even clear he was going to recover. But he did eventually. And he summed up this whole thing that I've been talking about that's leading to bodhicitta this way. He said, the fact that we all suffer means that we're all in the same boat. And that allows us to feel compassion. And again, we don't have to like our boatmates. And we certainly don't have to give them a bye or a pass on what they may have done. But we all are in the same boat, and that's kind of a colloquial way of describing interbeing. I remember when I first went to prison, I told somebody something. I was a little ashamed of saying it because I couldn't really articulate it, and I was afraid he was going to say, what do you mean by that? But fortunately he didn't. I said, this is my practice of interbeing. Because it just kind of felt in my gut that that's what was going on, but I couldn't articulate it. And over the last number of years, I've realized that when I go into prison, or when anybody goes into prison, and Jane and others here can verify this who go into prison as well, initially it's like, holy crap, what gives here? I just walked through these 6 steel gates that close behind me, ching, 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 ching. And there's no dream of getting out and living a normal life, and the vibes in prison are just outrageously horrible. And what's more, superficially, the lives of the folks, many if not most of the folks I see in prison, superficially are very different than the life I live. So where's the interbeing here? Well, the interbeing I came to realize is that when I could still my mind, still all the judgment, and I think maybe Walt has experienced, a number of you have come into prison, a presence, a certain kind of presence, deep presence arises that cuts a lot deeper than the superficial surface situations in each of our lives. Suffering is suffering. Yeah, I will admit that I'm not sure I'd want to trade the kind of suffering that goes on in prison with the kind of suffering in my life. But that's just a judgment. Suffering is suffering. Dukkha is dukkha. Clinging, aversion, ignorance, delusion. It all arises out of that. joy is joy. You know, there's a lot of smiling and laughing in prison too. I mean, it's not just all grim. So when we add interbeing to compassion, we understand that since we're all connected at a deep level, fundamentally connected, not just distant cousins, but no separation, I can't just alleviate my own suffering. Alleviating suffering means alleviating it wherever we encounter it. And this is the bodhicitta that I've been talking about, that serves as an aspiration. What's the bodhisattva vow? Somebody remind me. Untold beings suffering. I vowed to liberate them all. Yow! That's pretty steep, but it's the aspiration. It's the aspiration that wherever we find suffering, we do what we can in that moment to alleviate it. So this is bodhicitta, and bodhicitta is what underpins and supports engagement. And engaging our practice is at the core of what Thai teaches us. And as I said, it leads to a very, very special kind of presence. And we've all experienced it when people are present to us in that way, and we've all experienced it when we're present in that way. And I felt real early on when I started going into prison that this, we teach meditation and mindfulness, but this presence, I don't know what you think, Margot, but this being present is such a gift, especially to people who, many of whom, if not most of whom, never had a compassionate presence in their life. And they're sure not going to get a compassionate presence in prison. And that's why Thai says that our presence is the greatest gift we can give ourselves and others. And that presence is a manifestation of bodhicitta. And this is the bodhicitta that we express in our out-breath of our life. When we go to work as a teacher, when we go to prison, when we do whatever it is we do, when we're loving with our family. And then this bodhicitta, this acting out of this place of bodhicitta as best we can. Because Lord knows if we start expecting perfection here, then we're really going to start suffering. Leads to greater insight. And it leads to more understanding. It's a positive feedback loop. And no, we're not going to be there all the time. We may not even be there much of the time. But the more we do it, the more we do it. So in the in-breath, this is what we cultivate. Now the thing about this out-breath is it's tiring. We're putting ourselves out there. It gives us things to process, to try to understand, to put together. And we can't, even if I was a lot younger and healthier, I couldn't keep this up for that long. So what do? We take a breath in, where we can process, come home, find refuge in our own practice and in our friends on this path. We come home to our Sangha to refresh, to rejuvenate our practice. And the thing about breathing in and breathing out is that even as you're breathing out, you're already preparing for the next out breath. And this is how we grow. This is how our practice deepens. This is how we cultivate bodhicitta and the compassion in the interbeing that are such important parts of bodhicitta. We breathe in and we breathe out. And in this way, we live. So let's take a minute, just a minute, to breathe in and breathe out. And the good part is we don't have to do anything else.